begins, and I do not mistrust the future. I do not fear what is ahead, for our problems are large, but our heart is larger. Our challenges are great, but our will is greater. And if our flaws are endless, God's love is truly boundless.
Before he became the 41st president, George H.W. Bush was born on June 12, 1924, in Milton, Massachusetts, to a wealthy family. He was very well educated, attending and graduating Phillips Academy, Andover, and Yale University, where he was recognized for his athletic skills and leadership. At 18 years old, he was the youngest pilot in the Navy during World War II and was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for bravery in action. After the war, he fell in love and married Barbara Pierce, and they had 6 children, one of whom went on to become the 43rd president, making Bush the second president to have his son also take office. Bush's own father was a senator, which influenced his interest into politics.
George H.W. Bush started his political career as a 2-term representative for the state of Texas. He then became ambassador to the UN in 1971, and in 1976 became director of the CIA. He served 2 terms as vice president to Ronald Reagan starting in 1981, before winning his own presidency in 1988, with Senator Dan Quayle of Indiana as his running mate, defeating Michael Dukakis.
Bush faced a number of foreign issues during his presidency. One of his main goals was to improve relations with the Soviet Union, which he did through the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, also known as START I. After having met Gorbachev in Moscow, he called for both nations to make significant reductions in the number of nuclear warheads. After this, he turned his attention to Panama, where he sent troops to overthrow the corrupt leader General Manuel Noriega. Noriega had been threatening the Panama Canal and other Americans living there, and eventually he was brought to the U.S. for trial as a drug trafficker. Then came the First Persian Gulf War. In August of 1990, Saddam Hussein, the president of Iraq, invaded Kuwait with the purpose of taking its land, wealth, and oil. This led to Operation Desert Shield, in which he called for immediate and complete withdrawal of Iraq from Kuwait. However, this and other United Nations sanctions failed, and America was forced to use its military action against Iraq, namely through Operation Desert Storm. Throughout this 100-hour land battle, which consisted of 500,000 Americans and 100,000 troops from allies, Bush and the allies were able to defeat Iraq's million-man army. However, when Bush turned his attention back to America, he faced an increasingly turbulent society.
By the end of his presidency, George H.W. Bush was criticized for the lack of reforms to a faltering economy, rising violence in inner cities, and a continuing high deficit spending. In response to these problems, Bush was forced to raise taxes, although he promised the public in his election that he would not. These domestic problems resulted in the failure of his re-election. Despite the anger over the lack of reforms by the public, Bush actually enacted several important policies during his presidency. He enacted the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, which would forbid discrimination based on disabilities in employment, public accommodations, and transportation. Next, he issued the Clean Air Amendments of 1990 in response to more environmental legislation after the environmental disaster of the Exxon Valdez. The Clean Air Amendments focused on reducing urban smog, curbing acid rain, and eliminating industrial emissions of toxic chemicals. In 1991, Bush passed the Civil Rights Act, which would make it easier for employees to sue employers based on the grounds of discrimination. Overall, Bush did create many important domestic policies, but he's remembered most for the foreign issues he dealt with.
George H.W. Bush's presidency was not without its blemishes. During his election campaign, Bush denied any knowledge of the Iran-Contra affair in which the U.S. traded arms for hostages. But later his decision to pardon 6 people involved, whose trials had not yet even begun, led to accusations of a cover-up. Bush was also embroiled in controversy regarding the First Gulf War. Some felt the U.S. should have never gotten involved at all, while others wanted the U.S. to do more to depose a totalitarian regime. This controversy survives to today and also plagued his son's presidency. Furthermore, Bush was often accused of neglecting domestic affairs for foreign issues and allowing the country to slip into an economic slump. However, much of Bush's legacy is a positive one. The New York Times referred to the passage of the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990 as the single most distinguished policy achievement of the Bush administration. Bush was a firm advocate for collective security, international cooperation, and the breaking down of Cold War animosity. Bush hoped that his so-called New World Order would be freer from the threat of terror, stronger in the pursuit of justice, and more secure in the quest for peace, an era in which nations of the world, east and west, north and south, can prosper and live in harmony.